Chapter 5, Forging Links in the Chain. When morning came, after what seemed a veritable reincarnation of the Arabian Nights dream, I arose with a guilty sense of having abused the night by indulging a dark, untenable secret, something that I dared not tell. Despite the wonder and beauty of it, I was strangely depressed all during the day, feeling how differently people would regard me if they only knew. This companionship with the invisible had established itself into a permanency, and I was never without conscious knowledge of its existence. When in conversation with anyone, voices would come whispering, telling of incidents in the life of the one with whom I conversed. To this was generally added the request to deliver a message, but pride always stood sentinel between the message and its delivery. Though at times, I admit I was almost persuaded into responsiveness, only to be deterred by the knowledge that the object of the invisible solicitude could not understand. The touch of a vanished hand. And the sound of a voice that is still. During the interval of this solicitude, the life of the person in question was to me an open book. Something seemed to impress every condition of his or her life upon my mentality, the future as well as the past and present. Another noticeable effect was that while this condition prevailed, the aura, or pale light, that envelopes the body, not only increased but scintillated, moving and changing, sometimes from one color to another. Different colors predominate in different persons, and are more pronounced and extended in persons in public life than otherwise. Under ordinary conditions, this light is barely perceptible even to the occult vision. And thus, the days went on as I struggled to adjust myself to living in two worlds, each exacting its obligations, while I tried to differentiate as to where the one began and the other ended. As the other, however, was so evidently a part of or continuation of this, I could only say world without end, and let it go at that. One Friday evening soon after retiring, Mian came and said solemnly,
"I am going away tonight. Be not deceived during my absence."
While I listened for some explanation, he vanished, leaving a sense of apprehensive loneliness which was not easy to shake off. Why had he gone? In what way could his going affect me? How could I be deceived? All this I was asking myself in perplexity when it dawned upon me that I needed rest and relaxation from the mysterious disturbance that had not abated since the advent of the voice the Sunday before, and I rejoiced in anticipation of the much-needed rest. In my heart, thanking Mian for his consideration, as the physical and mental strain had been intense, I forthwith adjusted myself comfortably and relaxed in the presence of sleep that was upon me without any wooing. As I lay between sleeping and waking, the bed shook violently, so much so that I was nearly thrown off. The dog, with a piteous whine, jumped off and scampered to his refuge underneath, and I sat up, listening and looking about inquiringly. There was nothing to be seen or heard. Dreaming perhaps, I murmured, but what about the dog? In sleepy indecision, I lay down again, but scarcely had I done so, when the shaking began, more violent than before, and so continuous that the bed seemed rocking to and fro within a radius of about 2 feet, while from under the bed the mattress was being pushed up, as by hands directly beneath me, rolling me about from side to side, with such energy and persistence that it was all I could do to keep from rolling off. When I became thoroughly annoyed, this form of manifestation abated somewhat, giving place to a weird creaking that kept up so monotonously that it became nerve-wracking in the extreme. When it seemed I could not endure it another instant, I demanded of the very silence what it meant. With startling promptness, the answer came.
"Oh, nothing. We are just keeping the fans busy. Note the effect."
With this a cold draft struck shivers into my very soul, to the accompaniment of a chorus of laughter which gave the impression of a joke coming from such a source. It is impossible to conceive of what a weird, creepy sensation such laughter produced, the appalling incongruity of the dead, joking and laughing. It was something beyond my appreciation, yet why should they not laugh and joke? A soul out of the body is little changed from that within. As there are fun-loving souls on earth, is it not reasonable to suppose this propensity remains the same after the transition from matter into a more unrestricted environment? A complete and sudden change would mean loss of identity, the one thing we do not care to lose. No future, however wonderful, would appeal to us if we were not to be ourselves. It is the exalted condition of the conscious ego that appeals to us, all of which is a problem that only evolution can work out. As I shivered in the uncertainty of this new phase of spirit life, a disillusioning phase, I must admit, all kinds of manifestations were going merrily on, knocks ranging from the soft telegraphic clicking on the metal bed to boisterous noises about the room and house. Footsteps were hurrying in every direction, little lights were coming in and going out of existence all about the room. Forms and faces gave me fleeting glimpses of themselves, the doorknob turned and shook as though someone tried to force an entrance, after which a hand seized upon my arm so real that it frightened me into the belief that someone had forced an entrance into the room. The screen doors were opening and shutting, as well as the door between the bedroom and dressing room. Papers rattled, chairs moved about noisily, and voices began telling unreasonable stories, as hands pressed upon me, peals of laughter coming ever and anon. I tried desperately not to be afraid, but success is not always a matter of effort. It was beyond endurance, and when I would have gotten up, I was alarmed to find myself incapable of doing so. Something seemed to hold me. This was the proverbial last straw, and my temper grew several degrees warmer than my body, as I chafed at the insolence. Then came the cry of my little dog, under the stimulus of which I jumped up and, weak though I was, sat on the bedside, and called to him. He persisted in refusing to obey my calling, therefore, as soon as I was equal to the exertion, I crawled under and brought him out in a condition of such abject terror that he seemed more dead than alive, which fact added new fuel to my resentment, and I began casting about for some means of suppressing the annoyance, when a calm, challenging voice came.
Why did you not command us to go, after which we could not have remained?
Go now and never return, I commanded, with a feeling of relief that such company could be so easily disposed of. After listening to them go, and the pall of silence, as the calm after the storm, came upon me, I half regretted my harshness, but not enough to recall them, as I did not care to have my little dog frightened to death, to say nothing of myself. Experience has since taught me that there is a law in the world of shadows that at the mundane command spirits must go at once, and without question. This I consider the most expedient prerogative connected with the communication between the two realms, as there are undesirable spirit entities as well as any other contrary to the preconceived ideas, as to the infallibility of all pertaining to the spirit world. Discrimination in the choice of unseen associates is even more essential than in the seen, as their mental influence is greater. While the rule of, like attracts like, is generally applicable and can be relied on to a certain extent after one acquires spiritual understanding, there are varied and noteworthy exceptions that one passing into the privilege of such communication very soon discovers, more or less, to his or her disillusionment. When I finally returned to bed, I waited in fearful uncertainty for a renewal of the awake, but everything was still almost to oppression, and while I listened for their coming, sleep came instead, shutting out all further disturbances, making it a matter of indifference whether they came or not. The next day the desire was strong upon me to tell these strange things to someone who could understand, if such a being existed, and in this connection, I remembered my manicurist, who had, some time previously, told me of a medium she had consulted and was enthusiastic with satisfaction. Although at the time I had laughed most heartily at her credulity and shocked her by telling her exactly how I felt about such matters, now I was determined to find out where her oracle could be found and ask for audience with her. My nails were not especially in need of manicuring, but an hour after this resolution my hands were on the manicurist's table, she filing away on my nails, as we discussed this most important personage, I affecting an indifference I was far from feeling. When I came out of the parlors, I dismissed the car, fearing that, as it stood waiting before the spiritualist temple, the chauffeur or number might be recognized by someone who knew me and that my inconsistency would become a matter of comment. I was not ready to give publicity to that which had revolutionized my views where they had been most dogmatic. As I had never consulted a medium, nor attended a séance, nor believed anything I had ever heard about such things, except to their discredit, it is small wonder that this radical departure made me feel like a guilty thing, that I was violating one of the highest standards of my life. 2. My fiancé was a well-known freethinker, and I knew my action would meet with his direct condemnation. It was a long walk, and a hot day, and after all the agony of it I arrived at the temple to find the object of my inquiry away for the summer. Disappointment weighed heavily upon me as I turned away and walked slowly home, resolved to venture no further in such premises, feeling that I had exhausted all my initiative for radical departure from the trodden path, to which I had returned and was meekly treading, half ashamed of my digression. What a week it had been! Passing to all appearances just as any other week since time began, and yet I wondered if in all the world there was another who had experienced the marvelous and radical changes that had affected me. Science, where the supernatural is concerned, had laid its scepter down. The flag of materialism had fallen into the hands of knowledge, the dark door of death had swung on its creaking hinges, revealing a light beyond which consumes the darkness that makes us tremble on its threshold. Truly I seem to have changed my personality, and if it is true, as a man thinketh, so he is, I had. The same to all appearances, and yet how different. As I expected to spend the morrow, as I had the previous Sunday, with my fiancé, I retired rather early, but not before taking the precaution of asking my landlady to call me early, as I could not anticipate what the night might require of me and would take no chances of oversleeping and missing the 8:30 train to La Porte, where I expected to meet my fiancé and his party and spend the day cruising about the bay, a recreation we both enjoyed. With this end in view, his yacht had, during the afternoon, steamed up to Sylvan Beach, La Porte, as a precaution against delays or disappointments. It was thus I lay dreaming of the morrow and its anticipated pleasures, without a thought of the invisibles, when Morpheus folded me within the mantle where dreams and realities are one. Chapter 6, With the Coming of the Dawn.
Awake, get up.
Came a command to which I gave obedience almost before I was consciously awake and sat sleepily on the bedside, wondering if I had been dreaming. All doubt was dissipated by the voice.
Get out of bed.
I stood up and moved uncertainly to the middle of the room, noting a suggestion of the dawn in the semi-shadows that played about and the gray that pressed upon the window panes. This I noted with surprise as I fancied the night still young, feeling that I had slept only a very short time. The clock striking 4 relieved further conjecture as to the time.
Pull down the shades.
Was the next order, which I obeyed rather mechanically, pulling them full down, rendering the room quite dark. There was no thought of turning on the light, as I felt instinctively the darkness had its purpose, otherwise it would not have been enforced by lowered shades. As I stood hesitating, waiting for further orders, as it were, I was directed to take a footstool to a given point in the room and sit upon it. This I did without question, realizing that it was Mian who was giving the directions and was pleased that he had returned, but refrained from expressing myself thereon, as something a vast deal more important seemed in process of manifestation. After sitting as directed for a few minutes, drowsiness came over me, the heaviness of which caused me to forget that there was no back to the stool, and my leaning against the back that wasn't, resulted most disastrously. Thoroughly awakened, I scrambled up, with resentment burning in my heart because of the seemingly whimsical preference for a stool, when several comfortable chairs were in the room, for which I would have exchanged the stool, but a voice vibrant with command smote my consciousness.
Sit where you are.
And I settled down with an emphasis in keeping with the tone of command, conscious of an almost overpowering chilliness, as I waited for I knew not what. As I conjectured, I perceived a little light fluctuating before my face, fixing my attention. As I looked at it, it assumed a pointed shape and began moving slowly away, my eyes following. So it continued to move until it stood directly over a white easel on which was a life-size portrait of my fiancé. Here it stopped, scintillating, growing in size and power of illumination. After holding this vibratory, scintillating position a few seconds, it moved, with a rolling effect, downward until it paused directly in front of the face of the portrait, where it stood quivering, emitting a light sufficient to make the features distinctly discernible, despite the darkness of the room. Thus suspended, it began quivering into nothingness, and darkness was over everything. While there was nothing especially interesting about this, I sat with my attention focused on the spot where it had disappeared, almost breathlessly waiting for the indefinable something to happen, but as nothing eventuated, somewhat disappointedly, I looked about the room and was fascinated by alternating shadows of darkness and light, blending so intimately that they seemed a commingling mass of light and darkness, one yet distinct, moving noiselessly in circular waves toward the easel, which seemed the magnet. The light would quiver over the portrait, giving just a glimpse of it, when the shroud of the pursuing darkness would shut it out, and thus it alternated, becoming more and more distinct and individualized until a pale, bluish illumination fringed the edges of the shadows, making the separateness more pronounced, the lightness more weirdly effulgent, the darkness as an Egyptian midnight. The darkness would fall into the light like a great curtain, obscuring everything, and in turn the whiteness would come with a silvery glow, giving soft outline to everything within its area. As I gazed upon the mystic beauty of it, suddenly there came down, over and about the easel, a great flood of vibrating whiteness, lighting up everything with a radiance, revealing to my astonishment a clean, white, blank canvas, where only a few minutes before I had looked upon the likeness of, what was to me, the dearest face in the world. I bounded forward in the face of this daring obliteration, with rescuing intentions. But my rising attempt was firmly suppressed by a power, not as of hands, but a concentrated force, more powerful and impressive, that forced me down with an emphasis that checked even the desire to rise. Held by this strange power, I began wondering if it was possible that I could be dreaming, at the same time, felt convinced that I was not. Be that as it may, I was not satisfied and wanted something tangible that would bear material evidence when the light of day laughs at the dreams of night. I began casting about and summoning these mute, material witnesses that were to stand before the judgment of the morrow, and in so doing felt a sense of laying up treasures of victory that nothing else could give. First, I noted that one of the sheets lay partly on the floor, where it had been dragged as I made my hasty and half-conscious obedience to the command to arise. Also, there was one of my bedroom slippers with heel up and at right angles to the other. That was all I could see in the semi-darkness that was worthy of subpoenaing. Feeling these inadequate, I removed my engagement ring from the third finger of the left hand and placed it on the third finger of my right, a most unusual thing, as the ring was rarely removed from my finger under any pretext. Lastly, I reached over, not being permitted to get up, and removed an onyx tablet from the lower section of a table which stood near and placed it on the floor beside me. Thoroughly satisfied, I viewed my assembled witnesses and again gave my attention to that from which I had withdrawn it, with the assurance that no matter what developments the night might bring forth, these witnesses would stand as evidence against it being a dream, no matter how interwoven it might be with unreality. As the easel had been the objective of the preceding phenomena, I naturally fixed my attention on the spot where I knew it was. Intense darkness was prevailing at the time. This darkness was like a proscenium curtain, studded with miniature lights, and vibrating with variegated colors. It began to rise slowly, revealing beyond a flood of silvery light, holding within itself the easel, which was swaying lightly, from side to side, up and down, within a radius of about 2 feet. The canvas within the frame was no longer blank, there were 2 objects plainly discernible. Tense with anxiety at to what the canvas was about to reveal, I watched eagerly, as the swaying merged into vibrations, and vibrations into visible tremblings. The shadow of darkness came down, obscuring it entirely from my vision, abruptly changing expectation into disappointment, a reaction to whose agony only experience can testify. I could have fallen face downward on the floor and cried out against the cruelty of it, when a hand was laid lightly on my head and an encouraging voice was saying,
"Patience yet a little while."
With this I forced myself back under the strain of expectancy and sat watching and waiting, while touches came on my face, hands and hair, as though the invisible entities would assure me that I was not alone in the darkness. Suddenly the whole room seemed to pulsate, the very air became charged with life, thronging with unearthly shapes and shadows, alive with the very reality of the unreal. The coldness accordingly increased until breathing seemed difficult, but the easel, like a magnet, held my eyes, and my heart beat wildly with expectation. Slowly the dark curtain was rising again, and beyond, in the silvery whiteness, were the forms and faces of 2 human beings plainly outlined, and I was straining every nerve in the quivering intensity of hopeful recognition. Then a great illumination fell into the silvery mist with various colors playing within its soft meshes. As it spread over the entire room, it encompassed me within its glow, and I stared at that which stood before me, fully revealed and recognizable. In the quivering whiteness, the picture frame seemed only a window, and standing out beyond it, looking at me with love in their eyes and happiness on their radiant faces, were my parents, who had only a few years before passed behind the veil, which was now lifted that I might know they still lived in the mystic realm beyond it. No word was spoken, no sign given, and while yet my heart was calling out its love to them, they quivered into nothingness. Still I sat fascinated, gazing enraptured at the place where they had stood, yet realizing they had gone, as the calm eyes of the portrait were looking steadily into mine, bearing no evidence of having served as an impromptu reception hall for envoys from another world. And still I sat, held by the spell of it, the hushed, half-awed sacredness held me within itself, powerless to turn away from where the shadowy footprints of unreality had just fallen on the register of reality, breaking down the barrier between the two. I was startled by the landlady's knock on the door, punctuated by,
"It is time to get up."
The little dog, barking furiously, rushed from his refuge under the bed, glad, no doubt, to have some real, live, human being to take issue with, while I arose and unlocked the door. She entered with a cup of hot coffee, the one thing I needed most, as I was very cold and my nerves not up to their usual standard of steadiness. As I stood holding the coffee, expressing my appreciation therefore, I examined the mute witnesses which I had assembled for the light of day which had now come. I noted carefully the sheet which was partly on the floor, the one slipper, heel up, the ring on the third finger of my right hand, and beside the footstool, the onyx slab. This she noted, looking at me inquiringly, to which I vouchsafed no explanation, as we turned and went into the dressing room, where I drank the coffee and began, with her assistance, to make my toilet for the day, in accordance with the dictation of a voice which evidenced interest in my personal appearance for the occasion. The costume selected was an all-over hand-embroidered linen, champagne-colored, with everything to match, which made up in elegance what it lacked in appropriateness as a yachting costume. As I proceeded with my toilet, voices from the invisible almost drowned every other sound as they poured in upon me from every direction, causing a preoccupation of manner that even the light talk in which I indulged could not disguise, as was evidenced by her question.
Aren't you well?
Perfectly, I replied hastily, but realizing that indisposition would be the most natural excuse for my distrait manner, I added, forcing a little laugh, you know getting up early always puts me out of tune, but as I feel so unusually inharmonious this morning, I presume I am not quite well.
Would you care for another cup of coffee?
She asked kindly, expressing sympathy because of my indisposition. Thank you, no, I answered, assuring her of my appreciation of the solicitude she heaped upon me, feeling the unworthiness that is born of deception. Then, as if by mutual consent we lapsed into silence, for which I was very grateful. How I wished I could creep away to some quiet spot where there were no appearances to keep up, no voices, mundane or super-mundane, to interfere, as there was a sacred silence they seemed to violate. With hushed reverence my thoughts kept reverting to that which had just given assurance of love that outlives death, of ideals that persist through all forms of life's continuity. Chapter 7: A Day with the Invisibles at Sea.
Patty, I am here.
Came a sweet girlish voice, so familiar it startled me into forgetfulness that I was wishing for silent meditation, and in odd uncertainty, I whispered interrogatively. Lillian? Not a sound came as I listened with intensity not unmixed with perplexity, as I did not then know the only person who ever so addressed me had passed into the world of silence. It was a friend of my girlhood, who knowing and appreciating my musical aspirations had, in a girlish, jesting way, so termed me as I sang the hours away instead of joining her in the amusements she preferred. Strangest of all came the perfume of violets, which in earth life had always heralded her coming, and as I marveled, her spontaneous, inimitable laughter broke the stillness, and I knew it could be none other. The well-remembered voice came again.
Patty, you do not sing any more, my prima donna dreamer.
Oh, Lillian, I cried, don't, if you know anything you know why, but it does not matter now.
Forgive me, dear, I only wanted to convince you that it is really I.
I am convinced, but cannot realize that you have passed out of this life. Tell me all about it. What was the cause?
Oh, I rode out on fever.
She replied in her lightest, most frivolous vein and laughed in that old carefree, joyous way that made my heart bound with delight and the years roll back to the sweet intimacy of our girlhood days, which now seemed so long ago. Haven't you learned to be serious yet? I chided, for as much as I loved her, her frivolity was an imperfection to which at times I did not hesitate to call her attention. Tell me all about it. How long have you been there?
Don't take it so seriously, rather rejoice with me that I am free and happy and have been here long enough to pass beyond all obstructions and go where I will. I often come to you and go to Edgar.
A mutual friend.
But this is the first time you have ever recognized me. Edgar never has.
Let me see your face, I insisted.
Not now, but I will when I come in different vibrations.
But what is the difference? I questioned in surprise.
Much, as you will soon learn.
The honk-honk of the auto horn brought me back to a realization of mundane demands, and I hurried out bidding the landlady good morning, and was followed down the steps by her wishes for a pleasant day. As we drove toward the depot, I felt a presence beside me, and looking around I saw Lillian as distinctly as I had ever seen her in life, with her laughing eyes looking into mine and the same carefree smile on her lips. She did not speak but vanished almost as quickly as I saw her, leaving a sense of disappointment at the sudden withdrawal of what seemed a touch of reality to what had seemed very unreal. Since then, however, she has come many times, always joyous and carefree, painting the other world in such alluring colors that I would express a desire to be there with her, but she would chide me saying,
You could be as happy there, if you only knew the truth.
"Tell me all about it," I would plead, but she would answer always the same.
I am not permitted.
And I would wonder, and would almost resent her lack of frankness, as she hid her beautiful face behind the veil of the soul world and her voice was stilled. She never remained after she had made that answer, nor would she come if I called. As the train moved on and I sat complacently, I could have transplanted myself into fancy's realm and have been a queen holding court, so numerous were the beings who waited in state, as it were, for my recognition, which I gave or denied as I elected. The greatest exclusiveness marked my attitude toward them, as I devoted myself to reasoning rather than audience giving. There were too many. The Sunday before there had been one, on this day, 1 week later, there were many and each as anxious for conversational recognition as the one had been. I had already had a week of almost sleepless nights and trying days, and felt that I would appreciate a diminution, rather than an increase in the cause of it. I held the doors of my consciousness shut against any sights or sounds of the supernatural. At the same time, I was wishing ardently that there was someone with whom I could intelligently share my secret, someone who could understand, someone who could swim in the deep waters on which I floated aimlessly, tossed by the vagaries of its currents, without even a knowledge of its depths.
Laporte.
The brakeman cried, with such energy that it startled me almost out of the seat. My fiancé met the train, and we took a carriage from Laporte to Sylvan Beach, which is some distance from the depot. Spirit entities crowded into the carriage, pressing perceptibly against me while cold touches made me shiver, but I persisted in refusing them conversational privileges. While we breakfasted at an alfresco cafe on the beach, I could hear the word, "Goodbye," softly whispered and was curious to know why they were going no further with me, therefore, listened. These words came floating softly into my consciousness. All who dwell upon the land may not tread upon the sea. Some were saying, "But I am going with you," while others were murmuring sadly, "Goodbye, goodbye." Once begun, it was not easy to shut out the avalanche of voices that poured in upon me, but as we walked down the beach toward the waiting yacht, I gradually suppressed them. An hour later we were steaming over the placid waters of the bay, watching the sunlight make gold-tinted pictures on the tiny waves as they lifted their heads in the golden radiance. It was restfully beautiful, but the calmness of the sea never appeals to me. I love it in its wild, tempestuous moods, when it is a veritable living thing in its responsiveness to the storm element, when to be cradled on its bosom is to flirt with death, the thrill of which I have known many times, unmixed with fear. On this occasion, however, there seemed a harmonious blending of its calmness with the rhythmic coming and going of shadowy beings, who came on and off the boat with meter-like regularity, giving the impression that they were entertaining guests who had come into their domicile. 2. They seemed to be holding high festival of some kind in which they chose to include us. I had little time or inclination to delve into their motives, as I had given a whole week of my time and consideration to solving problems of their manifestations, and had only this one day of my comradeship and companionship to give to my husband-to-be, and so resented any interference, regardless of its source. After cruising about for some time, we cast anchor and angled with little success, tiring of which we cast targets and vied with each other in rifle practice. Although I have a medal, won by my rifle marksmanship, the inaccuracy of my shooting on this occasion showed the effect of the nervous strain under which I had been for the past week. I was exceedingly proud of my reputation as a marksman, and having no desire to forfeit it, feigned some trivial indisposition, headache, perhaps, although it is something I never really have, and withdrew from the contest, and when I stopped the others stopped also. Some of the spirit entities manifested relief, as the noise had seemed rather disturbing to them for some reason. After lunch an anchor was raised and we steamed on, headed for Houston, which was a matter of several hours' steady traveling. As we steamed on, the attentions of the invisible horde did not abate, nor were they the only intrusions upon the pleasant realities by which I was surrounded. A dream picture, the vision of a Paris creation, my wedding dress, pearls hand-embroidered on white net, over the softest pearl-white satin, which had come only the day before, kept intruding itself upon my thoughts, a veritable vision of loveliness. I seemed to see myself robed in its elegance, just as I had viewed myself the day before in the mirror with more than satisfaction. As I was hugging to myself the pleasing vision, a voice interrupted.
"Waste not your dreams on that dress, you will not be married in it."
How preposterous! I could have laughed at the absurdity of it, despite all of which there was an undercurrent of apprehension, which I attempted to shake off and take up the golden thread of my dream again. But the gold was out of the thread. And lead had entered instead. To more effectually shake off the depression that seemed determined to settle down upon me, I arose and walked about, and finally requested the pilot to permit me to steer, which he readily did, knowing that I so enjoyed steering that I had practiced myself into efficiency. There is something fascinating about holding a splendid yacht in one's hands, as it were, beside the intelligent direction of which her great bulk and strength are as nothing. In about an hour, somewhat tired, I relinquished the wheel and sat down entirely relieved of the depression that had weighed so heavily upon me.
Tired?
Asked my fiancé in a matter-of-course way, and sat down beside me. Just a bit, I answered, the current is rather exacting today. Looking critically into the water, he said.
And so it is?
And as if by mutual consent we lapsed into silent admiration of the glories of the setting sun, as the gold played among the luxuriant foliage and wildflowers that grew beside the ship channel that leads from Houston to the sea. The fragrance of the blooming magnolias filled the air with a sweet heaviness. The birds and butterflies were singing and flitting everywhere with a joyousness that was contagious. As I gazed enraptured, with my heart in perfect accord with nature's harmonious offering, the scene changed, just merged into something quite different. I no longer looked at trees, vines, flowers, and flitting birds, but was staring with wide open eyes, far out over hills and valleys unto a mountain, leading up the side of which was an irregular path, narrow but deeply cut, as by the treading of many feet, and upon the path journeyed a lone pilgrim, trying as one blind, or in the darkness, to keep within the path, despite its wearisome irregularities. This path led into an immense, silent city of the dead, with its tombs and monuments gleaming white, far out toward the setting sun. There were many graves, one freshly dug, and I beheld the lone pilgrim disappear within it, and even as I looked in wonderment, the same being was moving out beyond it, on what seemed a continuation of the same path, which became deeper and wider as it went higher and higher up the steep mountainside. The pilgrim went steadily on, climbing higher and higher. When it was all but disappearing in the high, dim distance it faced about suddenly and dimly, but distinctly, I saw myself. Then I was staring at the sun-kissed foliage with its birds, butterflies, and flowers. Beside me sat my fiancé in silent admiration of the panorama that nature was spreading before us, and in blissful ignorance of the insert that had disturbed me. More than anything, the forces of mystery had yet confronted me with. I could not move my eyes from the scene, a great fear held me rigid, a revolution raged within, I was wondering if I were mad. And there is no agony so poignant as the fear that the throne of reason is tottering in the face of one's recognized inability to save it. I had not only seen, but remembered vividly, every detail of that which I knew had no existence. I could have cried aloud in the very agony of it. What could it mean? What would be the end of it all? A mad impulse seized me to throw myself overboard and thus end the tyranny of this mysterious force that held me in a bondage that I could neither explain to myself nor to anyone else, and there seemed no escaping it. Any fate seemed preferable to madness, the very thought was maddening. With this alternative uppermost in my mind, I arose and walked to the aft of the boat, weighing the matter in all its phases. When this mad impulse threatened to become a tragic reality, a strong, firm hand fell upon my arm, sending a sensation as of an electric shock through my entire body, rendering me so weak that I fell rather than sat upon a chair, and a stern voice was saying,
"How cowardly! Thousands have spent their lives working and praying for one little crumb from such a feast as is being served to you without the asking.
Why not serve it with less bitterness?" I complained. "If you would only explain things to me. You must know how sorely my soul is being tried."
The soul that is too weak to meet any demand made on it is unworthy of the cause that makes the demand.
"But you know what I saw does not exist," I persisted.
In so far as you are concerned it does.
"Yes, but suppose I told someone."
Of which there is no necessity.
I loathe things without rhyme or reason.
This is not without reason.
Utterly weary, I turned away and sighed so heavily that my fiancé looked at me in quick surprise and questioned solicitously.
Are you not well?
"Perfectly," I answered, shaking off the lethargy with an effort and forcing a smile. "Such an ideal day we have had."
As all our days together are.
He responded, smiling as we arose and went forward where we stood indulging in inconsequential talk, watching the falling of the evening shadows, and feeling the witchery of the twilight hour, as the yacht plowed on amid the soft splashing of the water. As we neared our destination, I went down into the cabin to bathe my face and rescue my hair from its wind-tossed dishevelment. The invisibles were even in there manifesting themselves. I felt myself immune against any surprise, feeling that the surprise element had been exhausted, that I had reached the limit, and had thereby gained a superiority to any surprise that might try to foist itself upon me. I remember thinking rather jocularly that I could look on unmoved if the yacht suddenly turned into heaven or that other place, equally famous, or rather infamous, as a future residential section. Then the boat was docking and I hurried up on deck just in time to step off without a moment's waiting.